hoping this has gone live. Okay. There we go. Okay. Obviously, this is my first time doing a live stream, so as soon as this sort of my audio is coming through to you guys, just can someone just say in the chat that it's that they can hear me well and that it's all coming through, and then we can sort of get going. Cool. Awesome. Thank you. There's a bit of a delay there. Okay, right, might as well just jump in. So this is a little bit of admin before we sort of start. I'm happy to take questions from basically anyone, as long as they're somewhat related or directly related to the Landian Philosophy of Bitcoin, because this will be this is sort of a self-contained lecture of 4 which I've got planned, this being the first one. And obviously these will then become videos on YouTube, so I'm happy to answer any questions, but some will, if they're not directly related, I'll do them in the Q&A or whatever. So yeah, happy to answer any questions. So yeah, we're talking about Land's Philosophy of Bitcoin. I'm pretty excited about this. I've wanted to do this for a while. Also, just share this everywhere you can, because it helps me out, and it'd be good to get a good group in here. Right, so what I'm going to be covering is... One sec, I've just realised I've got the audio on that one. There we go. Right, so what I'm going to be covering is firstly the basics of Bitcoin, but I'm not massively fussed about the basics of Bitcoin, because you'll realise why, hopefully by the end of this lecture, but also in the second lecture, you'll realise why. Basically, when we're talking about Bitcoin and cryptographic technology and blockchain technology, these things are important, but they're important in connection to this and not just solely on their own. So I'll briefly cover that technology, but really that's all an empirical problem, which it is related to the transcendental in its own way. So I'm sort of briefly covering that, and then also in this lecture I'm briefly covering the basics of Kantian critique, which I think are the most important aspects of Kantian critique, which you'll sort of need to fully understand Land's cryptocurrency. And then at the end I'll look at the most important parts of the foreword, and just the foreword of cryptocurrency. So someone's already said there's 6 chapters, but you're only doing 4 parts. So I'm doing... What am I doing? I believe it's naught, and then this introductory stuff, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. Some are shorter, some are longer. Now, one thing I'll say is like the extracts that I've pulled from cryptocurrency are like the most dense parts, which I believe contain the most important information. Now, with that said, this is a super complicated philosophical document, right? It's ridiculously compact. It contains a ton of references. So really, we're dealing with, if we look at the lineage, we're dealing with primarily on a philosophical level. We're dealing with Kant, of course. We're dealing with Deleuze and Guattari. We're also dealing with Heidegger. And the Heideggerian stuff is really interesting. On an economic level, we're primarily dealing with Austrian economics, which we'll get to. So just a brief... I don't know too much about the sort of biography of this text and, how it came about or whatever. I remember when I first interviewed Land, he was still writing it back then, and sort of, making it clear it's a really difficult thing to write. Now, so the version that's sort of available online, which I think has sort of now been all culminated in one place, is at the link there. That's etscrivener.github.io/cryptocurrency. So this is the version 1.0, October 31st, 2018. So, like when I went to put down the notes to this, I sort of thought, okay, one should really have some prior knowledge of Kant's critique of pure reason and common blockchain technology. But I'm just going to include these because I probably will mention them in a fairly specific way, which you know is in that Landian sense. And also these lectures are really going to be for those who want to understand Land's philosophy of Bitcoin. And I like just that bit, and I emphasize that because you could draw out connections between the cryptocurrent and even Thirst for Annihilation, stuff in Fang Numena. Of course, you could easily connect it with Zeno systems, but I think they would probably be fairly forced connections in a way, and I think Land's doing different things now, which I don't know. So this, just to sort of emphasize them, even though we might start talking about meltdown and its importance and the body without organs and things along these lines, it's not, there isn't these like huge correlation between the two. And I mean, I'm sure they could sort of, these things will come up. So someone's already asked, is it recommended to read Cryptocurrent before the next lectures? It's going to help, but this is sort of just an overview of what cryptocurrent really is. These four lectures are just about what cryptocurrent is. So I mean, you could read it. It's a very, very dense document and would take you a long. This is, as far as I'm concerned, as someone who's obviously spent a lot of time with Land's philosophy, this is easily his magnum opus. This is a masterpiece of philosophy. And anyone who's interested in Kant, this is a genuine masterpiece of Kantian scholarship. It's absolutely impeccable. But enough sort of bigging up Land. Let's just get into it. He wouldn't really care for that, I'm sure. So I'm going to begin with Bitcoin. I'm not going to spend a massive amount of time on Bitcoin, right? So it's invented, developed. So this is, when I'm speaking about it now, I'm speaking about it in, these terms will come up later, and I'm sure some of you already know them, but I'm speaking about it in terms of the empirical sense of the inside, which interests us to a degree, but not to a huge degree. And that's in the Kantian sense. So, I mean, when we're speaking about it just in this everyday, normal sense, Bitcoin, it's invented, developed, whatever. We can't say arrived. That's more of a transcendental thing. It's invented, developed by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008 as, the first mainstream cryptocurrency, which is cryptographic currency. And cryptography is simply the art, the technology of being able to conceal communication, conceal data from third parties. And the third party thing is probably one of the most important cornerstones to the cryptocurrent. And we'll see why. I mean, to the point where we're talking about third parties now in terms of that economic Bitcoin sense, and actually that goes all the way through transcendentally to the idea of the death of God. And how the hell we pull all that together is super exciting, right? So it's a digitally secure store of value. That I think is fairly clear on that empirical level. We'll get to that idea of value on a transcendental level in a bit. It's introduced the concept of the blockchain, which is like a public ledger that includes permanent records of everyone's transactions. And of course, the importance of this public ledger is that it's decentralized, so that you don't have a centralized bank which can, control it. So everyone who has a single node in this decentralized framework has to agree on the time frame of the succession of the blockchain, right? It's a chain of blocks, and everyone has to agree in a decentralized network on what has happened, right? And this has huge implications in terms of time, and to a degree in terms of space. But space, as we all should know, is basically a little slave to time. Everything's a slave to time. And it has a permanent record of everyone's transactions. If it isn't included on chain, the important thing to say is it never happened, right? Because it wasn't agreed upon, it never happened. And of course, this has huge implications with regard to time as well. And you can already see how, from this empirical way, we're sort of building up this objective framework. So it's also peer-to-peer, so anyone can use the network, and you don't need a central server or authority to run it. It runs itself. So even in this very brief empirical description, there are some huge things which will expand out into basically the most complex transcendental philosophy. Firstly, it runs itself. Yeah, that's right, we're talking about fully automated Deleuze-Guattarian machinic production. Whoa, what the hell's that? We'll get there in probably lecture 2. The centralization, right? Centralization is really, in metaphorical terms, we're talking about the idea of the removal of the transcendent, which is the removal of God and the removal of any larger third-party figures, okay? Anyway, we'll get to this stuff. Bitcoin uses public key cryptography, just like the web does, to secure itself. We all probably know the basics of Bitcoin, really, of generally what it does. So it's just a secure form of digitally secure store of value. Send Bitcoin to someone's public key, which looks something like that long string of letters. And actually, that is my string of letters. So if you do want to send some Bitcoin, that's in the description below. And they spend it by signing the transaction with their private key. Signed transaction and the public key, both of which are very public, and anyone then this peer-to-peer structure allows, without the need for a third party in this decentralized system, to verify what has happened. You see that you see the public key and it's been signed by a private key, and then everyone on the decentralized network simply agrees. But because of that, the importance is on the decentralized aspect. There is no central bank that you don't need the third party, right? But that third party, when spun out transcendentally, is super, super important. The blockchain, now, this is really important in terms of time later on. So Bitcoin's public ledger, as I said, that record of everyone's transactions, the public checkbook, is called the blockchain. It's called the blockchain because about every 10 minutes, a new block should be found by Bitcoin miners and added to the end of the longest chain. The miners, which, as we all probably are well aware of now, are thousands upon thousands of expensive machines located, usually I think in the Netherlands now and Denmark, to keep everything very cold, are basically computers which are performing a type of operation called hashing. So they're very, very simply, these miners are working out an algorithm which then allows you to reap the rewards of that block and also keep the whole system going. When you hash the data, it comes out completely changed, but in a repeatable way. If both you and your friend hash the same data, you should get the same output. So this is mostly used in the computer world to make sure files don't get corrupted when being transferred on the internet. If you run a copy of a file through a hashing function and compare it to your friends, if it's the same, you know that the files are identical. And anyone who's sort of installed an operating system will understand this, that you... when you get an .iso file of an operating system, you check the hash code to make sure you've got that exact file and nothing has been broken in the process. Bitcoin miners, they take part of that previous block, try and find some data and add it to the hash. It looks something like that. Now, as for those sort of hashing and the working out of the algorithm, there's certainly something interesting there later on in relation to the synthetic a priori epistemic distinctions, which I'll talk about in Kant. But this is a very empirical thing, and really when we begin to talk about the blockchain, it's that notion of succession which is the important thing. Someone just mentioned that I haven't mentioned yet. The important thing is also the scarcity of Bitcoin. Actually, I think I have got this coming up. There you go. Yeah, Bitcoin economics. So yeah, it's coming up. So as for the economics, now the economics is super important as well. This does completely relate to the transcendental ideas. I will tie all this back. But I just the importance of this empirical stuff, you'll see why, isn't of the utmost importance when we're talking about Land's cryptocurrency. The price fluctuates for the same reason any other price fluctuates, supply and demand. If more people want Bitcoin and no one's selling, then the price will go up, etc. We all should understand how supply and demand works. It's often compared to gold in the respect that there's a finite amount of it. If I own 1 out of 21 million Bitcoin, that means at most you could own 20,999,999. So there's only ever going to be 21 million. I think at some point there might actually be some added on, 160,000 or something along these lines. But I can't remember about that. If everyone else wanted to sell theirs. But the truth is, most people want to hold this because it's understood as a store of value and not money, not something which is used in relation to other goods. It's used as a store of value. And Bitcoin, it seems over the years, I mean, obviously there isn't some sort of direct marketing firm because it's very difficult to sort of correlate such a thing. Bitcoin over the years, I think, has struggled to sort of differentiate itself as whether or not it's something that should be spent as money and whether or not it's a value system. And a lot of people understand it as money, which I think is sort of incorrect. You really do need to think of it as a value system. Now, someone has also said there about 4 million Bitcoin are lost, no more will be added. So we all hear stories about people, the guy in England who's been, haggling the council because he had a hard drive with 5,000 Bitcoin on, which is now in their dump, and he's sort of saying, well, look, I'll give you half if you help me find this, 20, however much money is on that now. So, there's probably, 17 million roughly Bitcoins floating around now, and probably even more are lost, and, tons in various weird places which aren't going to be moved for years. Since a lot of people don't want to sell, the price goes up, it keeps on going up because more and more people are getting into Bitcoin and they just don't want to sell. Someone's asked their dumb question, but how can Bitcoin be lost? So one example is that guy with the hard drive. He bought 5,000 Bitcoin when it was probably about, I don't know, £100 to buy that 5,000, and he just thought, I don't care, lobbed it away, and now he's got to retrieve them. Another example is a lot of people lose their Bitcoins because you keep your Bitcoins in a wallet, and if you lose that password, there is no leeway. It's not like there's no third parties. So this is one of the big problems with no third parties. With when you have a third party institution with your account for monetary account, like on a bank account, you can say click reset password, and there's a third party institution who can verify yourself to give you back your details, or you can call them up and they can verify it's you. However, when you remove that third party, everything is flat on that decentralized level between a peer-to-peer network. So you are completely beholden to yourself. So if you lose the password to your wallet, you've lost everything in there, and there is absolutely no way to retrieve it unless you just want to sit there and go through every single password. And I believe there is people who've paid for extremely complicated AIs to just reroute passwords over and over and over again because there's a ton of money in there. The most important part about Bitcoin, the thing that's the most sort of revolutionary is that with Bitcoin, as I said, you don't have to trust anyone to send money. If you want to send money by the banking system today, you need an account number, you need a routing number, and most importantly, you need a bank. You need trust, right? We sort of take all this for granted, and we take the idea that we have this sort of not high trust really, but it's sort of low trust because you need all that to even do things. We're absolutely sort of beholden to the idea that, right, I need to send money. So you need this whole institutional framework to just be able to send your money to someone else, which usually involves a load of transactions, giving over a load of your data, and stuff along these lines. So, but the most important thing about that is you need to trust the banks to do this, right? And even though we probably don't think about this on a day-to-day basis, we definitely do trust them. We all have money in banks, and it sits there in digits, and unlike you believed when you were a child, and this is actually important. Obviously, when we were all kids and we thought, oh my god, the banks, I've got £100 in my bank. There's a little vault somewhere with 5 £20 notes and my name on it. Of course, that isn't the reality. The bank literally has, takes your cash, puts it somewhere, and there is digits on a screen. And that is what the bank has a view is you're correlating your name and your details to a string of digits which goes up and down. There's unless you might have deposited something such as gold or jewelry, then there isn't there isn't the genuine value isn't in there, and that's really important. Because with Bitcoin, what's important is, and right now I'll say this statement at the start, and it will be at the start, it will come across as nonsense, and if I teach these lectures well enough, by the end you should understand why it's basically the most important economic statement ever, right? Bitcoin is Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is worth one Bitcoin. That is absolutely nonsense. But when you begin to think about value in terms of actually owning the value and the understanding of a peer-to-peer network in terms of you all decentralize in a decentralized network, agree on what's happened and agree on the value, you genuinely have the value, right? So when you have the value in the bank, you have this symbolic relationship to a third-party system, which is basically based on trust and the symbol of what that money signifies. With Bitcoin, you have Bitcoin. With money, you have something very, very horrible, which is actually no longer tied to anything. Bitcoin is tied to itself in the sense that it's this transcendental value, and we'll get to this when I begin to talk about Heidegger in the next lecture, with the idea of Bitcoin, the word with a lower b, is this normal Bitcoin we're talking about at the moment, and that's that ontic empirical level of Bitcoin. Bitcoin with the big B is the absolute alteration to the economic system, which is transcendental, and it's on that ontological level that you're building up a transcendental value system. Justin Clark in the comments says value is a slippery concept. Yeah, it is, and that's the really important thing about Bitcoin is, and I'll mention this, it's in one of these slides. Historically, the alteration of value from use value to exchange value to monetary value, now we're at pure value. Bitcoin is value itself, quite literally. Someone else is sort of saying value is subjective, and this is why the Austrian economics is important, because, for instance, when we look at Marxist economics, value is entirely in relation to labor and labor time, which is put into the manufacturing of something. When we look at Kantian economics, value is in relation to price. So you just set this artificial price, whether or not people want to pay that price, and it's actually not in relation to the subject's desires. Austrian economics, on the other hand, comes in and just destroys those. It doesn't destroy those, but it says no, you're both wrong. Value is subjective, right? This copy of Gurdjieff's guide and index to all and everything, which I paid £70 for, is not going to be worth £70 for very many people, except people who are extremely interested in the work of Gurdjieff, such as I am. So there is just the implicit proof of subjective value, is that, well, and that's the Austrian point, is that, well, and I'm doing those lectures on Karl Menger, which I need to finish up, but he's constantly just saying, look, it's just subjective. Every single thing is subjective. Well, whether or not people want to trade, however, how much they charge is subjective. Really, we live in a sort of pseudo Keynesian economy where price is just put on everything, and if you said, right, this thing is £50, well, it's not 50, it isn't worth £50 to me, and for someone else, that's a really good bargain, right? So Bitcoin does work in that Austrian framework, which we'll get to. A point of all this in terms of the economic thing, in terms of the economics of Bitcoin, is you own the actual transcendental value, right? This value which rides the line between, we'll get there in a minute, inside and outside. You don't just own the empirical value, right? Because the strange thing with money is, well, it doesn't, at least this beard comb has a use value, which it can comb a beard. However, or this cigarette lighter has a use value, it can light a cigarette, or it can do a load of other things. Money just has this empirical symbolic value, which isn't tied to any use value. It's tied to an exchange value, but that's only an empirical exchange value, which is highly fluctuating. Whereas Bitcoin, it's very complicated to explain early on, and it's completely in relation to transcendental philosophy, so we'll get there. Bitcoin is transcendental value. It's a diagonal value which cuts through all this. Of course, I need to build this up and explain what I mean by this. So, moving on to the most important philosopher who ever lived, Immanuel Kant. Right. Very, very simply, if someone said, what is Kantian critique? What is the critique of pure reason all about? Why is it so important? And I believe, very roughly, you can actually explain that in one line. What critique is attending to... let me start again. What Kantian critique is instead of, as Hume, Locke, Berkeley, the rationalists, the skeptics, the empirical skeptics, the empiricists, etc., everyone before Kant, what they did was attend to experience via conditions which are unquestioned. What Kant did, and it's the most important thing ever in philosophy, is to say we need to first attend to the conditions of experience. So that is to say, instead of simply accepting the experience we have and just not even thinking about the conditions, and then philosophizing on that experience, right? We sense, we touch things, we think about things. We primarily, sense is the big thing here. You know, like, I see this green light, or I see the color green, I see this shape, it moves in time, in succession, like this, right? For it to go from here to here, it has to have some form of temporal succession. Instead of accepting that entire experience, instead of accepting that entire experience, and then going from that, right, as just going like, right, whatever, that's how it is, and then let's go from that, which, by the way, is the analytic reading of Kant in Strawson's The Bounds of Sense. He basically goes from Kant and says, okay, Kant's done all this stuff, but let's just, what Kant has outlined, let's just accept that then as the reality, and that's what we've got, and let's go from that. It's not really very productive. Instead of doing that, you go, well, hang on, we've got this experience. We've got this experience. Well, what are the conditions of the experience, right? What conditions me, and what conditions my mind, and what conditions all my faculties to be able to say, well, that's green, that moves, that's a shape, that's there, right? So the problem, someone's briefly said, will this live stream be saved to YouTube? Saved onto YouTube later. My first time doing this, I looked this up. Apparently, as long as it's under 12 hours, which I'm hoping it will be, it does just automatically save it, so it should be on there. The problem is regarding then whether or not objects conform to our senses, or our senses conform to objects. Right? It's this reversal of the arrow. Okay, so for instance, let's say objects conform to our senses. Right? That means there's an object out there, and the arrow from the arrow from the lighter comes from the lighter to here. There's the object. The object conforms to our senses in the sense that that is exactly how it is, right? That is the object conforming to our senses. What about if the senses conform to the object? It's the whole same thing again. So what's Kant doing? Kant is saying, here's what's interesting. When you see the object, and it's sort of like putting, well, I've got a pair of glasses on, so it sort of helps. When you put a pair of glasses on, let's say there's like a sepia lens on them, everything has changed. Kant's point is that in the object being apprehended by the subject, it's representing itself to you. Because we have to attend to objects and the empirical world and the external world via our senses, we can't say, Kant never says it isn't exactly as it is out there, but he never says it is. He says we simply can't say, because, well, right, for instance, if we see something, it has to be processed by our senses first. It has to be processed by our vision, by our sight, vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell. It has to be processed by them. So it's like almost like it's going through a filter, and then we get it. Which is why the best way to sort of phrase it is, when people talk about Kantian representation, right? You have a representation of the world. The best way I've found to phrase that, to sort of memorize why that's important, is you have a representation of the world. There is the world out there, whatever it is, and that we call the noumenal. We can call it the thing in itself. That's already there, and then in being apprehended by us, it is represented to us. So we can't say whether or not this is what we see, what we sense is exactly as the world is. But we also, you know, it could be, it couldn't be. Kant's basic point, however, that he stresses is we just can't say. Which that's the transcendental right there. Is you have the phenomena, which is representation, and you have the noumenal, which in sort of Landian terms, which he uses fairly often, it is you have the inside, which is the representational world that subjects are in, humans are in, and you have the outside, you know, the outside coming in, right, which is those noumenal, elusive, often horrifying forces of the outside coming in, which of course we will comment on. So, you know, when I look at a tree, am I seeing the real tree? In which case my senses would conform to the object, right? My senses see it and it's exactly as it is in the real world. Or is it a representation, right? Is it conforming to my senses? My senses, in sensing it, sort of alter it in some way. And in that very process of sensing. And in probably if you want to start with Kant, probably one of the best documents ever is the letter to Marcus Hertz, where he outlines in transcendental philosophy extremely well. He states, however, our understanding through its representations is not the cause of the object, save in the mind, in the case of moral ends, nor is the object the cause of the intellectual representations in the mind. Therefore, the pure concepts of the understanding must not be abstracted from sense perceptions, nor must they express the receptions of representations through the senses. But though they must have their origin in the nature of the souls, they are neither caused by the object nor bring the object itself into being. Basically saying we're just in this representational phenomenal world, and we can't really say what it is we're attending to. Okay, so if something is being received by us, received by our senses, for Kant it is not what's been received which should be of interest, but the process of receiving itself, right? So that is the experience, right? Me looking at this object is the experience. That is not important to Kant. His point is what conditions that. We have to look at them, otherwise we can never get into the truth. Otherwise you're just living you're just assuming that you're in, you're assuming what is. Those conditions are just don't even matter. But what conditions it, that has to be the important thing for Kant. Otherwise we can't even say what reality is, because we haven't attended to the conditions of it. Okay. This is somewhat important, mostly in lecture 2. So lecture 2 is very deep in Kant and the Bitcoin overlap, and then there's sort of economics, and then there's just even more complex stuff, and there's Heidegger at some point. But Kant's sort of most important thing, I think, maybe one of them, synthetic a priori, whatever, judgments. A priori, we've probably all heard about these. A priori and a posteriori are known as epistemic distinctions, right, relating to epistemology, the study of knowledge, or how we know what we know. The most important one, of course, is synthetic a priori. Now, we'll get to that. A priori, synthetic a priori, you can have analytic a priori, you can have synthetic a posteriori, right? A priori and a posteriori are relating to what we know. Analytic and synthetic are linguistic distinctions in relation to the sentence at hand. Okay, so what the hell does that mean? If we look at the chart, I understand that my webcam is over it very briefly there. So analytic, all bachelors are unmarried. Linguistically, that sentence is completely contained. It's actually called conceptual containment, because the concept of being unmarried is implicit in the word bachelors. So that whole thing is analytic because it's contained. Then we have synthetic. The man is sitting in the chair, right? There's nothing contained in that because there's extra information that has a connection to the empirical world, so you have to go out and investigate it. And I'll give you a great trick for sort of working these things out. Then you have a priori. Once again, all bachelors are married. This is true by its very nature. And a posteriori, the man is sitting in the chair, right? So when we mix these up, the analytic linguistic distinction that what everything's contained within the sentence, and a priori, true by the very necessity. If you have a priori analytic, you're basically saying the same thing. It's a logical statement. All bachelors are unmarried. If you have you can sort of ignore this one because it's hypothetical and it just has to be worked out anyway, which is analytic a posteriori, which is the man is sitting in the chair, which has to be worked out, right? Synthetic a posteriori, so the extra knowledge needs to be added empirically, which means that if the man is sitting in the chair, if we state then, okay, the man is sitting in the chair, what do we need to do? We have to get up. It can't simply just be worked out by ourselves, right? Like a maths equation. We can sit and we don't have to investigate the empirical world. And the importance of synthetic and a posteriori is that you have to do that extra investigation into the world, the empirical world, right? So one great little trick that I was taught ages ago to be able to sort of differentiate these is, if someone has to get up from their chair to figure out whether something is true, that just will completely change everything, right? It's probably going to be synthetic if you have to get up, you have to go out into the empirical world. If you say it's raining outside, right, that's something that needs to be investigated in the empirical world. The point of these, you're thinking, well, what the hell? This just sounds like a load of philosophical jargon which doesn't help anyone. The point of these, which all culminates in synthetic a priori, is what if you had new knowledge which is absolutely universally true, So a priori being universally true, but it's new. How the hell does that happen? For Kant, when we look at maths and new knowledge, which is universally true, which you don't have to go out into the empirical world to investigate. Well, that's maths, right? You don't have to investigate the world to have new knowledge of math. You can literally develop quite literally universally new knowledge without investigating the world. You can just do these sums. So that Kant's sort of important point is that there's just this new knowledge that where the hell does this, where does this arise from? So synthetic a priori in that sense is just this development of universally true knowledge, which is added to our collective consciousness of not collective consciousness, collective data store of all human knowledge, and it's added, but it's also universally true. Okay, so it's not this sort of contextual thing like the man is sitting in the chair. This is a universal truth along the lines of 2 + 2 = 4, and you can begin to explain that out. There's a couple of people, couple of comments in here. So Justin Clark, I guess you're also perceiving the object as it appeared a fraction of a millisecond prior, since it took a certain amount of time for the light reflected off it to reach your eyes. Okay. You've actually opened a massive can of worms with that, because you mentioned time. Okay, let me roll off my Kant stuff. For a subject, there needs to be well, we can actually use a priori again here. There is 2 a priori forms of sensibility for the subject. There's space, right? For, once again, go back to my lovely lighter, which I'm not using. I've quit smoking. For this to even be an experience, there has to be space. I don't know how anyone could deny that. There has to be what we consider space, right? It's moving around in space. Cool. But for it to be able to go from here to here, there has to be time. It takes time in the idea of linear succession for it to go from here to here. So for Kant, the 2 fundamental forms of a priori sensibility are time and space. I put them in that order because time has to come first. You can't have space without time. Otherwise, what the hell would it be? Now, that brings, that is where we could draw in one of the connections to earlier Landian stuff, in that idea of, well, are we as sort of creatures which are caught in time and space completely trapped in the cage of linear time, right? The sort of the thing I think which messes with people's minds in regard to Kant is the idea that time, we can't say whether or not time is or isn't linear, but we can say it's very likely that that's just the way we experience it, right? The fact that this goes from here to here in that succession, or if I throw it across the room and it hits the door, the fact that those 2 things are in that order isn't a universal truth. It's simply due to with the fact that I represent, or time and space are represented to me in that form. So what is going on the other side, in that's happening in the phenomenal world, but what's going on in the noumenal world? Well, that's just not what time is. Okay, that's just not what time is. That's a representation of time into linear chronic time. Now, of course, this has big importance when we go back to, we've probably all seen the sort of now memed Bitcoin solves the the problem of absolute time. Blockchain creates absolute time. So when we begin to think about, well, whether or not there can ever be a correlation between the time of the inside, that is our linear time, where things are going forward and back, forward, in a progressive succession, whether or not there can ever be an ontological correlation between the time of the inside of the phenomenological empirical subject and the time of the outside. This is what Bitcoin solves. Okay, so that's absolute time. There is now a verifiable successive data, right? We don't need to do the rest of the lectures. Right. I did actually have a slide on it. Okay, so that's the transcendental aesthetic. Okay, that space and time provide us with a sensible form of experience. We absolutely need space and time. They just have to be. You cannot have experience without space and time, quite literally. You can say, oh, well, what about dreams? Even in dreams, there is a sense of time, even if it's not linear. It's in relation to our understanding of linear time, and the space in dreams is just as empirical in the sense that your dreams are also still made of atoms. It's that framework of time and space in dreams is still that three-dimensional space, and linear idea of time, which we are accustomed to. So we say, well, what about that drug trip where I did a load of psychedelics and everything went non-Euclidean and whatever. That is still in relation to the fact that you need time and space for that experience. It's that's how it's represented. So so the big question is then how, from the absolute tumult of impressions we sensibly receive, do we end up with what we perceive to be reality? What is the objective framework which allows for this? So this is the go-to undergrad Kant thing, which is the transcendental unity of apperception. Wow, that sounds complicated, and they do tend to overcomplicate it. But so there's this notion of, well, how, if there's just this constant barrage, how can we even correlate this? This isn't super important, but I'll quickly bring it in, right? So right now here I have a cup of coffee. So in terms of before there's anything, right, I can see there's a white mug, and then when I look in it, there's a black viscous liquid, and it smells, like cheap, I think it's Nescafe Azera coffee with a tiny bit of sugar in it. It smells sweet. There's also like a feeling of warmth, blah, 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 blah. The transcendental unity of apperception, emphasis on unity, is you unify all those things and they are conceptualized into, it's a cup of black coffee, right? Or another one would be, it's orange, triangular, it's sort of long, and it has green things coming out at the end, and it smells sort of earthy. Oh, unify all that. It's unify that, and I perceive it. It is a carrot. Wow, thanks, Kant. That's very helpful. So the important thing then is that time and space aren't. They're not features of absolute reality. They're not features of the universal reality of absolutely everything. Once again, they are representations. The way they are presented to us is a representation. So they aren't the forms of absolute time and space that are everywhere. They're only features of our subjective, as in hence subjective reality. Everything which is found within time and space, the objects are of our experience, right? They are represented to us, and they are not the things in themselves. So we're always at this sort of level of separation. So this is why when we think about cryptocurrency or cryptography, the point of cryptography, and Land sort of emphasizes this, is, well, it's a means to elude one from the sort of securer communication from being seen. In that same sense, we're just talking about transcendental philosophy in the sense that what is the cryptography is in our senses. Our senses are sort of an inverse one that we probably don't really want, but it's an inverse form of cryptographic transcendental sort of sensible confusion in the sense that everything is then the true reality is then hidden from us in this transcendental form of cryptography. Of course, then you begin to think, well, hang on, Bitcoin, what's going on with Bitcoin? Because it's sort of this function which we will slowly begin to see the connection between the two. And so to be able to, just very, very briefly on the end of the transcendental aesthetic and nearing the end of the basics of Kantian stuff, for Kant, for us to be able to actually deal with anything, because so far I've only really dealt with the sensible side of things, you have to have sensibility and you have to have understanding, and they're two separate things. And you can sort of think of understanding as conceptualization. So what's happening on the sensible side of things? We apprehend this object, intuitions of objects, we intuit them. They are nothing without us then intellectually informed of a conceptualization, being able to understand what it is. And those two things are brought together, and that is the full representation of what we have. So you can have all the sensibility is a white sphere, a white cylindrical thing with a black thing on. That's nothing until a conceptualization comes in, which is a sort of an associative development process for man to be able to go, oh no, that's a coffee cup, and all these things happen. So Kant does emphasize many times that it's very confusing because all these things happen in such an what we would consider an instant, that they're never really split out. Oh, it really is bad. Right. So that is, as far as I sort of need, the the basics of Bitcoin, and that's 45 minutes. The basics of Bitcoin and Kant. We can actually move into Land's stuff. Okay, so I mean, the first thing here is Land in 0.032. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, as a philosophical text, and this is Land writing, and in my opinion, as a work of critique. The target of critique is metaphysics conceived as a specifiable cognitive error. As determined by Kant at the origin of the transcendental critical enterprise, metaphysics is understood as the systematic attempt to apprehend conditions of objectivity as if they were themselves objects. So it's this, once again, when we think back to, well, how can you have an objective framework if you are beginning from that understanding that you are always hampered in your quest towards objectivity by the very conditions imposed upon you. And whenever I think of transcendental, I always think most of the time it can often be replaced with the word conditions, or the conditioned, or something along those lines, and it makes you sort of realize what's being spoken about. I mean, Land is reading this 9-page Bitcoin white paper as a philosophical text, and as a work of critique, as a work of conditions. Now, and then he goes on to say, registered within the terms of the transcendental or critical philosophy, it is a departure from the pseudo-object of the present in the direction of current time. So the pseudo-object of the present, as you'll begin to see, is, well, the notion of the present. Yeah. The present is always the idea that we have a present is in relation to the past, right? That's something that's been, and in the notion of the future, something that's going to appear, which implies a notion of linear time. So the whole idea that the present is a pseudo-object is simply because linear time doesn't exist, right? That is conditioned. That is the conditions of our experience. That is our representation of times. So, Land sort of is beginning by making it clear that this whole thing can work. This whole thing only really makes sense by the development of that inside and outside, right? So when we're talking about Bitcoin on this transcendental level, it's in relation to that outside, that ontological level of things. So, and the notion of crypto begins with a complex task whereby, one is immediately talking about something which is mediated. Okay, cryptography, much like the transcendental process, is a mediation. And this is something, there's a really great lecture by Dan Robinson on the notion of Kantian representation as the difference between immediate and mediate, right? So if the object was immediate, then it would conform to our senses and we would have absolute reality. However, the object is mediated, and the process of cryptography is a mediation. It's a transcendental mediation in the sense that the information is mediated to us, and we're left with something which isn't the true reality. And it's in that trying to cohere those two realities that you are trying to develop an objective framework, so that you can say from the inside what is objectively happening in both. And the point is, with Bitcoin, like the overarching point of all of this is that for Land, Bitcoin coheres the two. It finds a correlation between the two, so we can objectively have a sort of bridge between the phenomenal and the noumenal. So, all that's meant by the pseudo object of the present is that present is a subjective present. So then when you say, well, okay, well, what's Land is mentioning here in 0.011 in the direction of current time. The current time thing is in relation to the blockchain. That decentralized on a noumenal economic level correlation of an agreement of what has happened, which then begins to build a succession. However, what is happening on that economic level and on that level of sort of machinic value isn't happening in the empirical level. We've moved away from the empirical. So that succession of the blockchain that we're viewing on the empirical level is like a signifier for an objective time frame, or a direction of current time. So that I will get into more, because obviously that's the huge the huge thing. But that's very, very briefly. Obviously, you're going, okay, well, how the hell do what differs that from accountancy software, and what differs that from clocks, and blah 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 blah. There is reasons for that, but this is just the introduction, so I'm not going to go too deep into all these things because there's quite a bit more. Okay, and then in 0.02, so Land is stating, since money systems install an intrinsic economic intelligence preceding all reflective theorization, economics, uniquely among the sciences, inherits a field of objectivity whose arithmetization has already taken place. There is a lot going on here in a Kantian sense, right? When we begin to think back to Kant in relation to geometry and arithmetic, the implication is here that in that process of hashing, in that process of Bitcoin mining, there is this sort of transcendental economic machinizing of synthetic a priori processes happening. Because geometry and arithmetic are those two things, which, let's just subsume them and just call them mathematics. The mathematics is that single thing which, in relation to those epistemic distinctions that we spoke about in the linguistic distinctions of a priori, a posteriori, mathematics is the synthetic a priori, where you can develop continued objective knowledge without having to deal with empirical reality. So in that process of hashing via the algorithmic processing of Bitcoin in relation to the development of a successive blockchain, you have, on a transcendental level, in connection to the empirical level, you have a pure synthesization of objective reality due to the fact that it's a sort of machinic synthetic a priori process which is developing constant mathematical proofs of time, as opposed to proofs which have first come from empirical reality. So that reality is reversed. Okay, so the audio is cutting out a bit. I think it's fixed. That reality is reversed, where the processing which is happening on that noumenal synthetic a priori sort of mathematical processing level is then coming back into empirical. You're not beginning from the empirical, which is that's the importance of the transcendental sort of flip. Is you question those conditions. You don't begin from the experience. If you begin from the experience, you're just beginning from the empirical, and the empirical is always going to be in relation to the subjective. So what can you say of objectivity? Whereas when we begin from that mathematical sort of machinic processing level, you're beginning from the pure conditions. So and then Land goes on to state, the economic event then is co-original with its semiotic double. It is enabled by signs before being represented by them, right? In subjective conditioned reality, signification is basically what we have to go by, because we're reliant on sense data. So, we're just constant signs and signals. Whereas, as I said, in that reversal, the process is first and then it's signified, right? The mathematic process is happening in that objective noumenal framework, and then it comes in, and then we sort of have to deal with it in the sense of, I guess, sort of like I don't know, blockchain sort of technology. So it's the difference between it's the question of representations in the relation to like the real of economics, and a noumenal forming of something before signification. And of course, it's an extremely difficult thing to say, well, this is something that has eluded signification until it's eluded sign, like the signs are secondary, as opposed to only being able to understand it because there's a sign, right? It's like being able to explain a tree without having any signifiers to do so. It's basically impossible, because what we're talking about is a process machinic reality before that other thing. So it's like a transcendental process before it's even conditioned. It's something that isn't in the subjective framework, and we'll sort of run into this problem many, many times, because it's obviously difficult to sort of break out of our subjective framework and talk about, well, what, you know, what is it that we don't know? Right? If we could explain that, then we'd know it. This is the big Kantian problem. It's why it's so important. Um, so then Bitcoin seizes philosophical attention because it is already doing philosophy, or what philosophy is still, on even rarer occasions, expected to do, and at multiple levels. It tells the truth. And this really is Bitcoin as an epistemological temporal agent. And that's a temporality, once again, which isn't related to the conditions, because there can't be truth coming from... Sorry, isn't related to subjective experience, because there can't ever really be truth from subjective experience. This is exactly why Kant begins from conditions. You can't begin from the experience because that has already been conditioned. So what can be said of a truth which has already been conditioned? You need to question the conditions of truth. The point is that Bitcoin, in its objective decentralized processing of that succession, is doing everything before it's conditioned on on the outside, and then that's coming through, and then there's sort of the bridge that we can work with. Okay, so Bitcoin is not understood primarily as a paper, perhaps because it is not primarily an argument. Its nexus of persuasion has migrated outward, in close association with the meaning of code. Critique undergoes accelerating automation. 0.04. Okay, this is sort of like, blast off point, which is basically, I'm of the belief here that Land is using the word code here in the Deleuzian or Deleuze-Guattarian. Though I hate the word Deleuze-Guattarian, because if you read that stuff, if you read the biography, you realise Guattari didn't have too much input. Anti-Oedipus he did, and then later on it was basically mostly Deleuze. Anyway, for Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari, code is this signifies all cultural abstraction immanentized into the language of abstract machinization. Okay, in moving abstractly away from being merely understood as a paper, okay, as an empirical sort of analytical theorization, Bitcoin moves away from anthropocentric understanding itself. The conditions of Bitcoin's very existence bring forth an inhumanism which accelerates its own becoming. Okay, so when Land is talking about in close association, its nexus of persuasion has migrated outward in close association with the meaning of code. As I state, cultural abstraction immanentized into just a pure machinization. You're no longer reliant on, when we go back to those synthetic distinctions, you're no longer reliant on a posteriori. You no longer have to. Its nexus of persuasion isn't on the empirical, right? And that's why the whole idea of trustless. Well, how can you have trustless? The only way you can really have a trust, the only way you can no longer need to have trust and to remove that trust as the transcendent, is to immanentize things and work on another level which isn't related to the empirical. Work on an objective framework. So Bitcoin machines value, and really, this is absolutely steeped in the language of Deleuze-Guattari. So Bitcoin machines value. It follows that the prevailing conception of technology as instrumental capability, subsumed under extrinsic ends, is among the very many things to fall by the wayside as the process escalates. Traditional categories of thought or conception and action or performance are mutually subsumed into an irreducible cognitive action. The strengthening diagonal, synthetic a priori, current passing between the notional and the actual, or and is, intelligence and mechanism, which in its aporectic articulation has been the exquisite torture of postmodern philosophy, is simply code. What the hell does that mean? Somebody tell me. So this is probably the most important quote in these beginning sections, which are indexed at 0. This introductory section. Not only does this explore the fact that Land is sort of adhering to the philosophical language of critique, But equally, Bitcoin is beginning to answer, or has already answered, a critical question in relation to diagonality, whereby intelligence, technology, and code are sort of machinic abstractions understood virtually as this potentiality for a continuation. And it's all about this remove. Well, how can you remove the third party trust? How can you have trustless, right? How can you not, in the sense of value, how can you not? How can you just remove trust entirely to the point where something just happens on an immanentized, horizontal, flat level? And in this, the only way that is possible is to move it away from the a posteriori, right? Move it towards the universally true, but which is developed from it's still developed in a synthetic process, which is that machinization of the reality itself on that other level. So the loop of Bitcoin auto production knows nothing of transcendence at any stage. Whatever might have sought to intrude, representing an extrinsic authority, is dismissed as a superfluous, trusted third party. The circuit is the entire thing, 0.06. So in this way, the critically, as in the term in relation to Kant, the critically productive capabilities of Bitcoin are synonymous with abstraction, which is like, it's sort of that Marxist alien power, right? That alien thing which comes in and overtakes the worker, that strange abstract force which can sort of relate to capitalism or productivity or production in itself, when we which is changed to in Deleuze and Guattari. That is coming in, and that is the thing that was taken here by itself, and it doesn't need any trust. It doesn't need a third party to bolster its proof of itself, because it is value in itself. It is an auto-productive system. So the capabilities of Bitcoin are sort of synonymous with that. And I mean, this is probably one of the few points where you could draw a connection to the other Landian stuff, in the sense that there is a very, very clear connections between what Bitcoin is doing on that noumenal level and what capitalism is doing on that noumenal level, in the sense that it's just anything which is extrinsic. For Bitcoin, it's that idea of a trusted third party. There is no trusted third party in capitalism. It's either used or it's unused. Otherwise, it's just superfluous. You don't need that for the process in itself, which is happening on the outside, which is this auto-productive thing in relation to whatever it is that capitalism sort of is seeking to produce. Okay, so in the sense that, in that accelerationist view, there can't ever be neo-capitalism, right? Capitalism is neo-capitalism. It just keeps going. It's we're going to change. This is post-capitalism. No, capitalism eats up the post and just doesn't give a crap, right? It just keeps going. It just subsumes everything into it. And then on a functional level, Bitcoin blockchain technology is pure quantified economic production, right? There's no, because of that removal of the extrinsic third-party trusted institution, it's pure in the sense that, so when we did sorry, I'll go right back to the beginning of Kant. The critique of pure reason, critique, which is critique, I can't remember what the original German is. Anyway, in the original German, if you translate it, Kant actually meant as in taking something to court, as if to say in front of a jury, this is this, can we all agree, right? So the critique of, when we all think of reason, in Kantian terms, you can loosely think of reason as working out a problem. How do we figure out a problem? Pure as in not related to the sensible. Okay, so it is a critique of nonsensible reason, right? Which is basically to say a critique of the conditions of experience, which aren't related to. And once again, when we go right back to that Kant, what's happening when we remove those connections to the extrinsic, to that in that way, you can begin to say that there's something authoritarian about the a priori sensibility of man, right? We that is almost, there's some trust in relation to that because, sorry, when we throw this object and it hits a door, then a sound happens. There is a trust in relation to that empirical extrinsic reality. Once that is removed and doesn't intrude, what is left is a sort of processual, machinic, automated circuitry, which is, well, there's nothing extrinsic to sort of attach it to, in the sense of when we think of money, right? Okay, we might have these digits on a screen, but something there's something further for Bitcoin than there is for money, and in that sense, it's pure, not connected to extrinsic empirical reality, pure quantified economic production, a systemization of economizing reality into allotments of its productive capability. Okay, so I think I've got a few more slides after this one, but um, very, very sort of quickly, right? Sort of probably about 70% of the way through here. The sort of super key points of why this is so important. Bitcoin and critique. The creation of auto-productive absolute time. So we've spoken about that idea of absolute time, that sort of bridge between the inside and the outside, the phenomenal and the nominal, and being able to correlate to one another to develop an absolute time which isn't in relation to the subjective and is absolute. And in the sense that it's auto-productive, right? It understands itself and it's trying to keep itself going, which is exactly what Bitcoin seeks to do in relation to its equilibrium mechanisms of both supply and demand, and in relation to the power needed for nodes, etc., etc. So in that immanentization, where you no longer need that trusted third party, which is which in philosophical terms I mentioned right at the beginning, is the removal of the transcendental. In the removal of extrinsic third party trusted institutions, you no longer need God. This is the land. Okay, we'll draw in a very early connection actually. That infamous chapter in The Thirst for Annihilation, Easter, where Land sort of says, look, I've had enough of the death of God, I'm just going to go finish him off, and goes to Jesus on the cross and begins to stab him. The point is, he can't die because you still have that sort of spatio-temporal framework of extrinsic legitimization, which we rely on in terms of in the sense of sort of a subjective authoritarian way. Bitcoin, I'll say this, Bitcoin finally kills God. Okay, there's no corpse anymore. It's brushed away. Everything is fully immanentized into a purely flat, horizontal, transcendental framework of machinic production, where value in itself is what underlies everything. Okay, and I'll get to what I mean by underlies everything. This machinization of reality into an autocatalytic, it's constantly producing itself of pure production. And I'll dig into these Deleuze-Guattarian terms in later lectures. But one of my favorite things is, and I had trouble translating this, and I did ask some people, but it's quite difficult to translate. So when semantically, I think this is one of the more interesting things, and it makes you realize what's going on a value scale, and brings in the Austrian economics. So I believe it's first in The Birth of Biopolitics for Foucault. And there's a few mention of Foucault in here, so I don't think he'd mind me bringing this in. Foucault semantically makes it clear that in the late 18th, I think it is, century, this term is brought in, Homo criminalis, which basically means human - criminal, right? But it's connected. It is suffixed, right? So it's one thing, human criminalis or human criminal. And Foucault makes this point of saying, well, if that is now the reality on that sort of conceptualized level, there's no such thing as a human which absolutely just isn't connected to this. You're either a human criminal or you're a human that definitely has the potential to be a criminal, right? You're a human non-criminal. But you're always in relation now to that semantic signified framework. And then the same thing, which is the more important one here, is that he goes on to say there's Homo economicus, right? An economizing man, a man which is, understanding the world in relation to, and I've written an essay on this called The Genealogy of Foucault's Numeric Power System. I think that was the name. The point is that, this numeric quantifiable culture sort of infects us on a conceptual level, almost like the outside coming in, and you're no longer a man who might just be existing in relation to quality or experience or just existence, or you're either an economizing man in the sense you're viewing the world that way, or you're a man who isn't economizing, right? As if that's a strange thing. And then I've sort of moved this off to say, in relation to Bitcoin, what we have is cosmos economicus, right? The entire reality, cosmos. I don't know how the Latin would translate that. Perhaps someone could help me out a bit more. The entire reality is fully economized, right? And you could say that happens with money, that we have now, GBP, USD. Those forms of money, as I'll get into in a next. Well, I know I'll mention it. I'll mention that now, right? What's the difference? Okay, so this is a very Austrian sort of take on this. And economically speaking, we used to, well, I guess if you go right back, we would probably have things like before use value and barter and early forms of economy and economizing. You might have potlatches and you'd have gift giving. You want to read Marcel Mauss on this, and John Cusson's got some things on potlatch, and Georges Bataille. The gift giving economy, and maybe read Masih Eliad's books on religion. But maybe very, very early on, there wouldn't be that economizing brain that is seeking to sort of have that profit and loss dynamic, and you simply give things because that's done on a communal level. Then that sort of moves through to barter, and barter, of course, it's the object for another object, which is pure use, right? If someone needs a lighter and I need a beard comb, then and we definitely don't both need them. You're not exchanging anything symbolically. There isn't a symbol of value. You're exchanging the empirical use value of these one for another, and that's an early barter economy. I'll give you 5 horses for whatever amount of grain, and you're not doing that as in terms of like an economization where you're trying to like gain or profit or loss or whatever. You're doing it because you need the use value, and the use value is completely there in that extrinsic empirical sense. Then we move through to trade and money, which really does begin with grain, when there was excess grain. But let's just go straight through to, like, you could say gold coins or paper notes. Even though they somewhat work, one, you have these ties to national economies. 2, you have these sort of they're controlled by centralization, which is specifically a transcendent and not transcendental form of things. And they are a symbolic form of exchange value. The value itself isn't inherent in them. They are just a symbol for something which is sort of developed. And it's very difficult to explain why it's different with Bitcoin. But Bitcoin has that, which is why I've stated pure value, in the sense that it's not in the sense of pure reason. Bitcoin, capital B, is connected to that ontological level of pure value, which isn't its value in itself, undeveloped and unconnected to its persuasion, as Land states. Its nexus of persuasion is not connected to extrinsic empirical things. It's a pure value which is then machinized onto reality, and in that sense, absolutely every facet of reality can be economized, because it's something that's I hate to say behind, because there is no levels transcendental, but it's the value in itself, which is already there, right? And then the empirical is later maybe applied to it. It's before the signs, okay? And that's why it's pure in the sense of pure reason. It doesn't have that connection to sensibility, which can roughly be understood as an extrinsic token of authority. So those are the huge things that we're going to try tackle in the lectures, and I think that's actually my last slide. It's my last slide. So there was a few little things that people were brought in here. Someone said, want to say that Bitcoin doesn't kill God; it aims to kill the believer in the believer. The believer in the believer. So the belief of the believer. So that they no longer need any more salvation. It doesn't kill God. Well, it's not sort of saying the same thing. Is that God exists in that belief in the transcendent, extrinsic authority, transcendent and not transcendental. In the transcendental, machinized destruction of one's belief, they stop becoming a believer and are immanentized onto the same level of economy. So I mean, it's a roundabout way of saying if you killed all the believers, the God might still exist, right? Conceptually, if you killed the conceptual belief, then the God no longer has that extrinsic authority to rely on. Bitcoin is the first synthetic universal constant. Yes, purity is anti-natural in the material world. No such thing exists. Pure is always contained impurities. Pure always contains impurities. Not in not in Kantian sense. So pure is just not related to sensibility. And as soon as there would be sensibility, then you're back to a conditioned experience. Um, so it's not like pure and impurity in relation to the chemical. It's just in relation to the connection to the sensible. But yeah, I think for the last 15 minutes here, so that was like the first lecture, which I've just span out in an absolute mess. Has anyone got any more questions about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and these things? Do you think we could say that what we can say about Bitcoin? Do you think we can say what we can say about Bitcoin for automated machines, for machine learning? In terms of like AI and machine learning, if it adheres to the same structures of not having a reliance on the empirical, which is like, this is what we're seeing with a lot of these AI, is that once the AI is allowed to go off on its own value system, which often turns quite, by liberal standards, nasty. Once again, you'll see. I'm using extrinsic or empirical authority quite brashly here, but you'll see that what has to happen for that thing to be reined in, that AI to be reined in, is it someone a conditioned experience comes in and says, oh no, we need to input some guidelines, and by that it then has this extrinsic authority, and it's no longer left to its own auto-productive capabilities. So I think the same thing definitely does imply to machine learning, but one of the problems of machine learning, as I understand, is even, we have these chess robots as a typical example that can absolutely destroy any human player, but the variables are extremely limited. It's like, you just know how to do chess. So it's like it would be a constrained one. And there's also the question of decentralization, and whether or not something objective is happening there. And I guess the more interesting question there is, like, could you have a decentralized AI in the sense that there is a decentralized economy for Bitcoin, right? Like, multiple AIs actually multiple, right? They would understand something, because their experience is I mean, this is a whole can of worms, because I've questioned someone on this before and they didn't really get what I meant. But if you develop an artificial intelligence which truly passes the Turing test, in what sense can we ever prove that an artificial intelligence's sensibility is beholden to time and space the same way we are? And I believe someone has, you can look this up, but I think it was mentioned to be me by Eric Wargo. There has been a quantum computer developed which has affected its causes, right? So this isn't a big thing for some reason, but there's been a quantum computer developed on a very minor level. It's affected the cause of the effect. So in that sense, that for me is like the biggest Kantian question of, well, what the hell's going on with the sensibility? How is that intelligence apprehending reality? So yeah. An AI more human than a human being. Oh, an AI more human than a human being, is that the other we are seeking? I think this is the problem though with this language, is like saying more human than human is almost like the postmodernism question. You still have that connection to the human, which is not there. I mean, this is always the difficulty of the discussion with transcendental things. Is it's just the outside. You can't be like, it's more human than human, because in that sense it's still human. It still has that conditioned experience. So an AI, in the sense that it begins before signs, as Land is sort of stating, and in the same sense of as Bitcoin, its method of persuasion isn't primarily, secondarily, it might have to like bring in some things that we understand on the empirical level. But if its method of persuasion is at first on that machinized level, which is primarily sort of related to that machinization of economization, as we were talking about, that algorithmic synthetic a priori processing. If it's related to that, then I don't see in what sense it could it could be different. And I think any true AI is now going to be reliant on this form of technology. What do you think of Searle's Chinese room argument and issues of intentionality? I've never read Searle's Chinese room argument, unfortunately. So yeah, sorry about that. But I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, one of the most interesting things that's going to be coming up in the later lectures is the Heideggerian analysis, which I was sort of, when I read this the first time, I was like surprised Land brought it in because I knew he hadn't read Heidegger. Well, last time I interviewed him, he said I hadn't read Heidegger in decades, and now he's using him again. Is the difference between, and Heidegger just a continuation of Kant, and Deleuze is just a continuation of Kant. Deleuze and Guattari, just a continuation of Kant. The Heideggerian notions of the ontic and the ontological in relation to Bitcoin lower B and Bitcoin higher B, these are absolutely unfathomably important for explaining what this is. So I think automated machines that base itself randomness looks similar to peer-to-peer systems of Bitcoin. Sarkon was looking for a machine diagonal in CCRE writings. Wow. Oscar Sarkon, man. Elusive. More directly, is the urgency promise of Bitcoin that it would seem to do away with the Kantian Freudian question mark epistemological difficulties that human participation in the valuation of a currency? Well, the valuation of a currency is the move away from a conditioned subjective valuation, as opposed to that's the point of Bitcoin equals Bitcoin, right? You could almost say in that that famous Heidegger quote, which everyone quotes for like the tough continental philosophy quotes, being is not being. Bitcoin is not a Bitcoin. Bitcoin big B is not a lower B Bitcoin, right? Ontological to ontic. Ontic in relation to valuation, that relation to the empirical reality of subjective, conditioned, spatiotemporal reality. That form of valuation is recursive within the empirical reality, and it is just a subjective form of valuation. Whereas Bitcoin is not a Bitcoin. The ontological reality of Bitcoin itself is an ontological reality of value itself, and of course it's I understand it's tough to explain. I'm not doing the best job of that because it's just stating it. But we'll build up on that. This is just an introductory lecture. Bitcoin equals AQ 135 equals diagonal. Man, I can't get back into gematria. I'm just going to go mad. Okay. I'll just give an opportunity for a few more questions, and then I think this has gone fairly successful. Do you guys want more of these live streams? I don't want to turn into one of those YouTube channels that's doing like 10 things you wouldn't believe about Bitcoin. But yeah, if you want more live streams, then let me know. Share this far and wide. Subscribe, and I've got like super chat and donations and stuff. So that's always helpful as well. So yeah, I mean the next two are all written up, and then the fourth one is I'm just sort of finishing it out. So there probably will be most likely will be one of these next Thursday as well. Does Bitcoin here mean only Bitcoin or all cryptocurrency? I think for Land, it absolutely just means Bitcoin, and there is a few references to altcoins, and I think really that's unavoidable considering like you're working with a pure machinic automation, right? Machinization. These things are just going to fly off, but it's almost like you can't replace the OG, right? I don't want to, you just there's too much going on in cryptocurrency at the moment, which I think is related to just useless sort of actually dragging itself back into a very strange form of valuation, which is relation to like mimetic empirical. I don't want to really go off on like a transcendental rant about the transcendent empirical authority of Doge, but in relation to the fact that that is an economy bolstered not by its own value, but by a completely subjective value created by mimetic social correlation between Elon Musk and silly stuff. I think Bitcoin is important for the fact that once again, its nexus of persuasion isn't reliant on those external things. There's no marketing. It's valuation in itself. Does this analysis rest on a future wherein economy has been completely tokenized? And if this doesn't occur, is this analysis moot? That's a very interesting question. I mean, we're seeing at the moment in the tokenization of basically everything that can be tokenized is being tokenized, and this is why I bring in that idea, which is still on the screen there, Cosmos Economicus, right? Absolutely economized reality to the point of sort of saying what can't be economized. And there's probably something interesting to bring in here. I'll bring in Michel Serres because it's a good way of seeing where land is moving away from it. So Michel Serres has this fantastic quote in the Five Senses, I think, though I could be wrong on that, where he talks about economizing man going into the animal, going into the Amazon rainforest, and basically stating even when he's away from all those empirical institutions of economization, banks, civilization, modernity, he still is economizing, right? You still have that propensity in the Deleuzian sense, in a way, to see the actuals, which are trees and plant life, and potentialize them via the virtual and be like, oh, that could be planks of wood, I could turn that into a house, that economization. And when we talk about the tokenization and the economizing of the entire reality, we're moving away from that, which is, it's not like extra homo economicus, it's cosmos economicus. The reality itself is economizing. It's not first with homo economicus, it's that from that conditioned reality, then we're economizing from that. Before the conditioned reality, the conditions, before the conditions, what conditions the conditions, the pure reality is economizing itself in a machinic way. And in that sense, it's to say that to say, well, everything could be completely tokenized. A lot of tokenization is just happening within the conditioned reality. To say like, oh, you could say, if you took it to the absolute nth extreme, you could say, right, have you bought enough air tokens this month? Otherwise, we're gonna, shut off your house's atmosphere or whatever, right? That would be the absolute end game of tokenization, is the tokenization of air. But before that is a transcendental, just that anything can be subsumed onto that level, whereby it is quantified into like a processed, a purely processed value system. This is worth X, and we understand that X in relation to a pure value system, which is Bitcoin. So there was another one there. What would you say about what you say about Doge is also true of the other cryptos? Yeah, 100%, 100%. Definitely. And I think that's why Bitcoin is important, is that I don't think you have that. There obviously is the mimesis point where it's being blown up, like at the moment, because, it's making loads of people loads of money in that empirical sense. But the confusion in there is that a lot of people are then buying it. They're holding it in the sense that the Bitcoin USD pair, they want more US dollars, right? So they want to utilize the transcendental to sort of run back to their transcendent form of, nationalized, trust formed currency token. But it's also interesting to think when I think the important point would be when the transcendental overtakes the transcendent, right? When no longer Bitcoin is seen in relation to the dollar, but the dollar is seen in relation to the Bitcoin, in relation to Bitcoin. Sorry, sounded like an old man there. The Bitcoin. Would Bitcoin still be philosophically important if it never exploded in popularity, or was its popularity inevitable? Inevitability is a curious word in relation to the idea of linear time, because inevitability, if something is inevitable, that's the implication that it's working on a linear framework, and at some point in the future that thing will happen. As we understand, that only happens in conditioned linear chronic time of the subject. So inevitability isn't that inevitability isn't a thing for Bitcoin, because it's not working on that framework. In the same way Land talks about capital building itself in the future, Bitcoin, I would say, is sort of within that same framework where, well, you to repeat what Land said to me, which helped me out a lot in relation to the Kantian time, you can't have time in time, right? You have time, you have time. You can't have another form of time in time. So our linear time, which is conditioned, is just beholden to how we experience it. You can't, but that isn't real. So whatever else is going on in time behind the scenes, when I spoke about that quantum computer, you begin to think about cause and effect. Well, cause and effect no longer happen, in the same way that free will and determinist debates are sort of decimated by that conclusion, in that, well, if you no longer have the past, present, and the future, well, then what's going on, right? That's not how time works. So in terms of inevitability, that's a difficult, that's a very highly philosophical question. Would it be as important if it never exploded in popularity? I guess you could sort of say that something such as this would only explode in popularity. You can't say otherwise. That's the problem. So it's sort of unfalsifiable. It's like saying, is there something out there that should be this popular? I don't know. If gold or uranium were as common as quartz, would it still have the exaggerated valuation? Scarcity or usefulness? What is the real determiner? Well, I sort of come at this from an Austrian perspective, because they're now producing diamonds, and ultimately they could just set artificial diamonds, which are apparently you can't tell the difference between them and real diamonds. So there's that's a subjective valuation, right? We just it's a subjective conditioned evaluation, which is completely subjective to someone. Like, diamonds are worth nothing to me. I couldn't care less, right? But because a certain amount of people understand that diamonds are worth that much, these artificial diamonds can also be set at that certain valuation. But that's all in relation to like a mimetic subjective form of valuation. So if gold and uranium were as common as quartz, would it still have the exaggerated valuation? That would be on whether or not people want to just decide, okay, we all agree, like, this is all worth this much. Whereas that's not how. So scarcity or usefulness, I mean, the scarcity element, of course, helps with Bitcoin, but to a degree, I almost think that scarcity and usefulness come after the subjective. You have the subjective valuation of something, and then you have scarcity. I mean, for instance, we could talk about scarcity, and we could say, okay, there's 5,000. That's a very low number in terms of the globe. Okay, there's 5,000 what? Mattresses covered in strawberry jam. All right, nobody wants them, right? Just because it's scarce doesn't mean it's immediately valuable. There has to be that subjective appreciation first, which Bitcoin comes in before, right? So, yeah, I don't know why I used mattresses covered in jam as an example. But yeah, so the scarcity debate's an interesting thing that will come in later. But it's like everything comes after. Not to be an annoying continental, but the value of Bitcoin is always already. There you go, the annoying statement. Okay, yeah, I think I'm gonna finish it up there, because it's like an hour and a half. I think it's a good amount of time. But thanks for coming, everyone. And as I say, subscribe, follow, whatever, all that stuff. Share this, and maybe if you really enjoy it, go to the Patreon. All the links are there, or donate in the super chat or whatever. But there you go. Not massively fussed about that stuff. But There's another question there. Speaking of scarcity and not usefulness, would you be doing a podcast on NFTs? I mean, that once again is just subjective valuation. The fact that some of those things are going for thousands of dollars, like a mimetic recursive loop, right? Everyone just agrees. Okay, we all agree that this little image is worth this much. We're sort of getting in a bit of a loop here, but would I be doing a podcast on NFTs? No, I wouldn't have too much to say about them. I mean, they're an interesting development of cryptocurrency economics, but yeah. Pardon me. Yeah. They might come up. I think they will come up. They do come up, I know, later on. But yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thanks everyone. It's been a fairly successful first Hermitix live stream. And thanks for all for coming in. It should be the same time next week, actually. I don't think I've got anything on. So yeah, same time next week, and it'd be far deeper into the Kant stuff and Bitcoin, and more about that temporal succession and the blockchain in relation to absolute time. Yeah, see you all then. Follow, subscribe, all that lovely stuff.